So for those of you who are not able to show up, will have access to some of the lectures. I really appreciate, Jean, thank you for your work. Yeah. Let me first give you a general idea about the potential final exam questions. And when you come to the final exam, which is the 22nd of May in the afternoon, and where would that be? It's in the it's a Folk Art Museum auditorium. So you should know exactly where the place is. Please to be there 10 minutes before. Secular Museum, I'm sorry, Secular Museum. And it's a 3-hour exam for those who've never been experienced this kind of thing. It's an interesting encounter. You're supposed to know everything about the course, and there are 3 hours to give you the freedom of expression. But not to surprise you, but to give you general sense what is required. We're going to have the part 1 and part 2, and in part 1 maybe 2 questions, part 2 maybe 3 questions, we're not sure yet. But these questions will all come from the list of the 10 questions, exactly the same. There's no change whatsoever. So you have, if you go through these questions, you know you're well prepared for at least 2 of them. And there's also a part 3. The part 3 will be one question if you haven't seen, but I want to assure you it's not going to be a surprise, not to suddenly look at the question, you don't know what it means. It is basically self-cultivation and a moral community, and a way of asking you to respond to some of the specific questions we have in mind. So it's a broader question, even though you haven't seen. So there'll be no surprises, and yet the burden for the reading period is to think about those kind of issues. Even you have to prepare for biology, for computer science, think about moral reasoning from time to time, so you can prepare yourself for that. You're not supposed to bring in any notes or any prepared texts. You have to be there to answer those questions at the time. So but of course you're mentally, intellectually well prepared, right? So let me go through the questions, and if you have any any queries now, you may ask me, and then you should have a fairly good idea what we have in mind. The first one with a quote: affection between father and son, rightness between ruler and minister, a proper sequence between older and younger siblings, trust between friends, and the division of labor between husband and wife. These are, of course, 5 relationships. Discuss the principle underlying each of the 5 relationships. Of course, this refers to affection, rightness, proper sequence, trust, and division of labor. Are these 5 discrete principles, or should they be subsumed under a higher idea of human relatedness? You may want to discuss each of the 5, and then you may also want to see how these 5 principles can be subsumed under some of the basic Confucian ideas. So it's clear. Number 2, as one of the major spiritual traditions in human history, Confucianism has its own distinctive way of being religious. Discuss Confucian religiousness with particular reference to one of the following texts: the Doctrine of the Mean, Instruction for Practical Living, and also the Western inscription, Zhang Zai's Western inscription. It's a very short statement about heaven is my father, earth is my mother, even such a small creature as I finds intimacy in the cosmos. So that between heaven and earth is my body, that feels heaven and earth is my body, and that directs the heaven and earth is my nature. All things are my companions, and all people are my brothers and sisters. Just one very short statement. I think in the sections next week, we'll have that particular statement distributed to each of you. You should have an idea what that is, if you want to address that. And we do have the inquiry on the great learning. So you may want to, of course, the notion, what is religion? You may have a definition of religion. What does it mean by being religious? You may have a definition about that. Okay. Number 3, discuss the meaning and significance of Li, with the ritual, rite, ritual propriety or civility in classical Confucian thought, as well as the relevance of this Confucian notion to the project of character building and community formation in our contemporary context. You might consider comparing and contrasting one classical thinker with one contemporary one. For example, you might write on Xunzi and Neville, or Mencius Figueret, or any combination of thinkers you may have studied. So if you want to address that issue, it's not just the classical, but also the modern, or modern interpreter. Right? Fourth, Confucius said, to study without thinking is futile. To think without studying is dangerous. According to Mencius, when a person's chickens and dogs stray, he has sense enough to go after them, but not when his heart strays. The sole concern of learning is to go after his strayed heart. Then, of course, in Xunzi, if wood is pressed against a straightened board, it can be made straight. If metal is put to the grindstone, it can be sharpened. And if the gentleman studies widely each day, examines himself, his wisdom will become clear and his conduct without fault. So the question about learning, but discuss the significance of learning in classical Confucian thought by addressing the following questions. What is the main purpose of Confucian learning? Why is the motivation of profit, benefit inappropriate for true learning? What are the similarities and differences in the methods of learning advocated by these three major thinkers of the classical Confucian tradition? Fifth, the Western conception of the person as a bounded, unique, more or less integrated motivational and cognitive universe, a dynamic center of awareness, emotion, judgment, and action, organized into a distinctive whole and set contrastively against other such wholes and against its social and natural background, is, however, incorrigible, it may seem to us, a rather peculiar idea within the context of the world cultures. This is the anthropologist Clifford Geertz's reading of individualism. So critique this position, I mean this notion, the notion about a person as an island, right, of the self and its implications for community from a Confucian perspective. How do Confucian thinkers' conceptions of the self organize personal moral development and social relations? In your analysis, be sure to note whether or not the emphasis on the self is the same for all the Confucian thinkers that we have read, or consider the metaphysical assumptions of Confucianism and this representation of Western ideas of the self. Okay? Now the sixth one is a bit complicated and requires a little bit of thinking. Quote, as bearers of obligations, we can demand proper treatment as conditions for fulfilling the obligations we assume to have. Similarly, if our human worth is predicated on our ability to fulfill responsibilities, we can demand of others, as a condition of acknowledging that worth, that they assume the conditions required for fulfilling their responsibilities. If we become more powerful and influential, we are more obligated, responsible, and duty-bound to assure the well-being of others. As a corollary, we can demand that those in power, gosh, this is a typo. Okay, I think I went through this quite a few times, but maybe there are other typos, but we'll correct them. Fulfill the responsibility of caring for the good of society. The basic human rights can therefore flow from political leadership. Rights understood in this way are not derived from ascribed roles in a social hierarchy by religious or aristocratic values, nor, strictly speaking, are they derived from duties and obligations owed to society. It is in the dignity and worth of the self as a central relationship that the justification for rights is located. This is just a quote, which of course argues the possibility of deriving rights from duty or duty consciousness. Write a critical review on this Confucian interpretation that duty consciousness can serve as a basis of human rights. Number 7, Confucius, Mencius, and Xunzi were all concerned with polity and governance and held different models of ideal rulership. Compare and contrast their views on the following 4 issues: characteristics of an ideal ruler, sources of political authority, the role of the official, how society should be structured. Then the famous quote from The Great Learning, The ancients who wished to manifest their clear character to the world would first bring order to their states. Those who wish to bring order to their states would first regulate their families. Those who wish to regulate their families would first cultivate their personal lives. Those who wish to cultivate their personal lives would first rectify their minds. And those who wish to rectify their minds would first make their wills sincere. Those who wish to make their wills sincere would first extend their knowledge. The extension of knowledge consists in an investigation of things. When things are investigated, knowledge is extended. When knowledge is extended, the will becomes sincere. When the will is sincere, the mind is rectified. When the mind is rectified, the personal life is cultivated. When the personal life is cultivated, the family will be regulated. When the family is regulated, the state will be in order. When the state is in order, there will be peace throughout the world. In fact, in the United Nations, what we call now the cultivation of a culture of peace. And this is the most appropriate statement concerning the cultivation of peace. The above quote is the famous 8 steps found in the Great Learning. These steps, in descending and ascending order, suggest Confucian idea of self-community, of course, included in self-community question of learning, and the relationship between them. Making reference to the Confucian classics you've read in the course and the ideas of Confucian thinkers, Confucius mentions Xunzi, Zhuxi, and Weiming, elaborate Confucian concepts of self, community, and learning, and the relationship between them. Then 2 short but complicated questions. Write a feminist critique of the Confucian tradition and an imagined new Confucian response to such a critique. The new Confucian response meaning the Confucianism that has already been criticized and therefore become revitalized. How such a criticism can be answered from that perspective. Identify the salient features in the Confucian worldview that are particularly congenial to the development of an environmental ethic. Now, do you have any questions concerning the format? You're going to have part 1, 2, 3. Part 1, maybe 2 questions or 3. Part 2, 2 questions or 3. And these, from anywhere 5 to 6 questions will all come from this list. And there will be part 3, which is 1 single question, a broader essay question will give you some guideline and how to deal with that. Yes? Okay, that's a very, very interesting example. We've been talking about this time and time again. Once we ask you to write on more than on 3 blue books, each question on 1 blue book. Even if you haven't finished that blue book, you use a new blue book to write another question. And so the TAs are divided into sections, and each section will grade each question. So you will not be graded by your own section head for all these questions. So that will assure some kind of equity. Okay. Any other questions? Yes.
Are the questions weighted equally?
Yes. I think what happens, I'm a little bit vague now, 33% that will be equal. And what we may have something like 30, 30, 40. 30% of the first, 30% of the second, and 40% of the final. Okay. Any other questions? Yes. There are 3 essay questions, so you should allocate your time and spend about an hour on each one of them. And of course, now you need to think about the broader picture, right? And some people do some calculation, you don't have to prepare 9. I don't know how the mathematics works. If you prepare 7, probably you hit all of them. But we're not sure how that actually works. Now, but I want you to keep in mind, talking about Confucian ethics now in reference to the global ethic, always keep in mind the 4 dimensions as a compass. The 4 dimensions of the self, community, nature, and heaven. So whenever you talk about the question of the self, you always think about how the self relates to the community variously understood. Whenever you're asked to respond to a question, I'm not talking about the final exam, please. I'm talking about in general. If you're confronted with a question related to society at any level, at the level of the family, at the level of the nation, at the level of the world, never forget how that issue needs to be related to yourself. So this interplay between self and community. But self is always understood both in terms of the broadening and deepening process. Never consider the self simply as an isolated individual. So you're familiar with the concentric circles, but also be sure that the self is also a deepening process. It's the self in terms of the body, the heart and mind, the soul, or the spirit. So the self is both broadening and deepening. The community is variously understood. And then you have a much complicated picture and how you orient yourself in the world in terms of these two dimensions. But the two dimensions is not good enough because you may suffer from anthropocentrism. Therefore, you need to be concerned about a reference which cannot be reduced, cannot be relegated to the background. That's the reference of the cosmos, or the reference of ecology. And that's the question of nature. Even if you're not religious, you're not concerned about any major religious tradition, there should always be a dimension of the human experience or the human sense of personal development which flows beyond the society here and now or the anthropological world. That's the notion about heaven or God or Allah or Brahman. It's always the ultimate meaning of life. What some religionists would call the ultimate concern. So if we look at the question about global ethic, how can we develop a global ethic? The new requirements for the world, for what we call the world order now, is that we need to go beyond this very narrowly conceived notion about the West and the rest. But it is so powerful, especially at this university, because the university represents, presumably, some of the best of the West. So this notion that there is the locus of the human progression or human development based upon our experience here now as the model for the rest of the world. Sometimes we're not even conscious of it, but it's so powerful as part of the mental furniture that we need to overcome it. We need to underscore the idea of the cultural zones. There's so many different cultural traditions, even within our own national boundaries, that the notion about the West and the rest, and especially the notion that we need not be too much concerned about those developing societies that are not going to have any impact on us economically, politically, militarily, socially. It's a mindset which is extremely dangerous. And it's a closed mindset based upon the only superpower that really counts. And unfortunately, and our politicians, consciously or unconsciously, also try to underscore that particular aspect. Some people say maybe it's better for us to return to a situation where there are two superpowers. One scholar even mentioned that America always needs an enemy to motivate ourselves. If we don't have an enemy, it's very difficult for us to motivate ourselves. And now the former Soviet Union is no longer an enemy, and China is too weak to be a threatening enemy, so it's very difficult to mobilize ourselves. I think that mentality, even though it's very pervasive, it's extremely dangerous. And some scholars recently now develop a notion, we're not talking about one superpower, we're not talking about two contending forces, we're really talking about the emergence of a tripod. There are three major powers in the world that we need to be aware of in order to understand the world order. Of course, the three powers will be North America with the United States, the European Union, and East Asia, including China, Japan, and other societies. But that, to me, again, is a kind of hegemonic thinking, which eventually won't work, because the world is really multi-centered. Even if we can believe that our power is great and maybe only three major contenders in formulating the world order, And still, all kinds of things that may happen in the periphery that will challenge the center. The periphery can become the center. The periphery may be in the Middle East, maybe in Africa, maybe in South Asia, maybe in the Middle East. And anything that happens in those areas, all these societies, all the world, the human community will be affected. This is the global situation. It's not just environmental issues, but issues of security, issues of confrontation. So in this sense, we have to go beyond the West and the rest. We have also to go beyond the Enlightenment mentality, because we've pointed out the two major defects. One is anthropocentrism from the ecological point of view, that's easy to understand. The other one is a kind of outmoded progressivism. The whole world is understood in terms of trajectory of modernization or development according to a unilinear progression, almost like the world. They call it convergence. The world eventually will converge into this particular pattern. No matter where you are now, eventually will converge. And therefore, it is important for us to, since we're here, we're certainly moving ahead, and all the other societies eventually from different levels will converge with this particular model. This is the Enlightenment notion. But now, a new vision, I think gradually accepted by an increasing number of people, it's multiple modernities. It is not particular that this particular version, it's predicated on two beliefs. One is the continuous presence of traditions in modernity. No matter what kind of modernity we experience in the United States, in Europe, in Asia, traditions always continue to be present, especially religious traditions, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, certainly Taoism, Confucianism, and other traditions. Even traditions of democracy, traditions of the market economy, traditions of civil society, traditions of the various ways of learning the values, transmission of the values, all these continue to be present. So the notion that modernization undermines traditions is still quite valid. But modernization itself is also shaped by different traditions. And in the globalizing process, more than modernization, that the diversity of cultural experiences becomes even more pronounced. That's the reason why globalization enhances the search for roots and the primordial ties. All the primordial ties that define who we are turn out to be more pronounced. That's the reason why identity politics, politics of recognition, and politics of representation are all so powerful in the late 20th century, early part of the 21st century. So in this globalizing process, we need to think about many different forms of modernity. In so doing, we realize the modernizing process that originated in the Western Europe and later in America turned out to be also very diversified. The modernization of France is different from that of England, from Germany, and yet within each country there are different models of modernizing processes. So then the question, if we know for sure now there's a form of modernity in East Asia, therefore all East Asian societies have been deeply under the influence of the West, and yet the forms of life in East Asia, in Hong Kong, in Singapore, in Shanghai, in Korea, they're all very different from North American or European forms. Is it possible for us to imagine there's Indian form or South Asian form, Southeast Asian form? Is it possible for us to imagine there's an Islamic form or even eventually an African form? Now that depends upon how we understand modernity. If modernity is simply understood in terms of economic accumulation, economic capital, we probably will not have this particular, we will have this model, and the whole societies will be classified in terms of different stages of economic development. But modernity is also understood in terms of social capital, cultural competence, spiritual values, and all kinds of other things. It's possible for societies that are less economically developed to develop other kind of cultural resources. Of course, each society has to reach certain kind of economic development to be considered as part of the game. Okay. In this sense, we may have, we must have a much broader vision about the world order, the new world order. The new world order should not be simply understood as an economic order. It should be understood as a social order. As a social order, in addition to accumulation of economic capital and enhancement of technology and science, we need to see the two values, how the two values would be harmonized and organized. One is freedom, the other one is justice. In a social world order, freedom and justice are the two major values that will have to be adjudicated. We have a major problem of distributive justice here, and that's the reason why Jack Rawls, his whole work, lifelong work, is trying to say in a free society how justice can be maintained. So one of the ideas is then you privilege, in your development, in your policy, you privilege the most underprivileged. And that is a fair policy, even though the idea of a quota system is now being seriously condemned and criticized. But still, to organize your society to privilege those people who are marginalized or silenced is not simply a strategy to develop certain kind of social harmony, but it is the necessary condition for a new social world order. The other vision that is being developed now is that a world order has to be pluralistic. You cannot have a world order that is totally homogenized. The question of equality and plurality. How can you have equality but also plurality? And therefore, many of the Confucian ideas about differentiation, even hierarchy and difference, all become very important in our more sophisticated understanding of a world order. And this world order, no matter what, will have to be gender neutral. It's not possible with the powerful upsurge of feminism, but also a sense of justice, a new sense of justice and equality. There's no possibility that a world order does not underscore the importance of brotherhood and sisterhood. In other words, a world order of partnership between genders. No way that you can, it's a major challenge to the Islamic world. It's a major challenge to the Orthodox Judaic tradition. It's a major challenge to Buddhism. It's a major challenge to Catholicism. And it's also a major challenge to Confucianism. Now, if the Confucian tradition is not able to rise above a male-oriented approach, the tradition is not going to survive very well in terms of its contribution to the New World Order. But if you compare the Confucian tradition with Catholicism, Judaism, Buddhism, and so forth, there's no structural, institutional framework in the Confucian tradition, with the exception of the family, in terms of the political structure in the Confucian tradition, that is an inhibitive factor. It is a very powerful inhibitive factor, for example, in the Vatican's conception of Catholicism. For example, can women become priests, can become cardinals, can become bishops, and so forth. And of course, in Orthodox tradition, can women fully take part in the ritual practice? In addition, this world order will have to take what now the UN's, United Nations major project of the development of a culture of peace. In other words, to recognize difference and their willingness to accept, not just enter into dialogue, which is maybe too high an idea to achieve, but the recognition of coexistence, peaceful coexistence as minimum condition. And also, the new world order, in terms of productivity, in terms of solidarity, it cannot but be in connection with the environment. In other words, now the environment as a constraint, the new world order has to be a friendly new world order towards the environment, towards nature. And there's no way we can develop a new world order based upon economic calculus. For example, the idea of economic productivity. This is the reason why in Davos, as many of you know, one of the most important organizations of World Economic Forum that started for about 35 years. And Davos began with the, Davos, maybe DA. This is a town in Switzerland. 35 years ago, they developed this whole economic forum. And the word globalization actually very much attributed to this group, using the idea of world. So they believe very strongly that economic development, like the water table, that eventually would lift all the boats. And so everybody would benefit. The eradication of poverty is an important feature. And for a number of years, many scholars simply accepted it as self-evidently true. Now, with the first challenge from Seattle, about 1.5 years ago, because of the environment, and now the second challenge in Davos, now there's alternative vision. So the notion that economic development itself is going to develop a new world order, which is no longer possible. So then you have to have a much broader vision about what the world order ought to be. And so the world order that is friendly to nature, that will further peace, that is gender neutral, that is pluralistic, therefore the emphasis on both equality and plurality, and try to negotiate the conflict and tension between freedom and justice, is a world order that's ecumenical. In other words, cosmopolitan. That's ecumenical world order. We can even say with if we believe a world order that will emerge will have this particular feature as an ecumenical world order, it has to be cosmopolitan. And then the test is that when any society, any continent drop out of the world order, is it possible for us to imagine a world order in which a very significant group of human beings are relegated to the background or marginalized? I think in Huntington's notion, for example, about the clash of civilizations, he totally ignored Africa. And because Africa is a negative example. But in the kind of ecumenical world order, Africa becomes one of the major challenges. Whether we can bring Africa in as part of the group, it becomes a major test, especially a major test for international governance and political leadership. Now, in this quest for a common ground, as a way of developing global ethic, most philosophers and religionists decided to approach it. This is very much contrasted with the Confucian approach. They want to approach it from a minimalist position. Rationally speaking, it's very easy to understand, to find the lowest common denominator that people can share. Let's take the case of Hans Kuhn, who is a noted theologian in Tübingen. And he could be considered now instrumental in developing this notion about global ethic. And if you look at, in terms of his own biography, we can say the approach to global ethic is a thinning approach, is to make everything gradually thinner, not too thick, very thin. Try to forget a great deal. Try to minimize the difference. Try to underscore the commonality. Hans Kuhn, as a Catholic theologian, for a number of years was involved in an internal Catholic debate between Vatican and the more liberal-minded Catholic theologians. So within the Catholic tradition. Then he moved out of the Catholic tradition and became interested in the dialogue between Catholics and Protestants, all kinds of denominations. He's done a lot of work. So move out of the Catholic thick context to the context of the Christian world. Then he moved out of the Christian conversation and broadened his scope to talk to Muslims and to Jews. So he entered into what we call the monotheistic dialogue, the dialogue of the three great traditions that all subscribe to the Holy Other as God. So this God-centered conversation. And then he moved beyond that and to talk to other historical religious traditions, talk to Confucianism with Julia Qing, to talk to Hinduism, to Buddhism. So the great historical religions, so beyond the three monotheistic traditions. And then he talked to indigenous religious traditions, Shintoism, and many other religious traditions. Finally, in this most recent stage, is to talk to people who do not have religious belief. So in 1993, in the World Parliament of Religions, he began this global ethic thesis, is to say, let's try to forget we're Catholics. We're all Christians. Let's forget we are Christians. We're all believers of the monotheistic God. Let us forget about the monotheistic God. Let's say we are all religious people. Let's forget about we're all religious. Let's say we're all human beings. So this notion is to try to develop an idea that would be acceptable to an ever-extending network of human communities. And finally, they reached a very minimum condition. Global ethic means the golden rule. And the golden rule is do to others what you will want others to do to you, or do not do to others what you would not want others to do to you. It is also means, the global ethic means the spirit of reciprocity. You treat others in the same spirit as you would like to have others treated you. And the focus of this, a great deal of intellectual energy or philosophical enterprise is very much devoted to this process. It's to focus on procedure, how we can talk to each other. What are the rules of the game that could be developed? How will we be able to communicate directly? Habermas, the German philosopher, developed this very important notion about communicative rationality. It's not a rationality with any substantive, not necessarily with any substantive notion about instrumental results, but if we want to communicate, what are the basic requirements of a conversation? What are the rules of the game that need to be established before we begin to talk, to exchange any ideas in any substantive way? We need to agree upon the procedure that we'll be able to talk about. We know that in many international negotiations, sometimes the shape of the table will take quite a few days to settle, and who's going to sit where, and who's going to begin to talk, and how much time is required, and who's going to respond. So all the rules of the game involved. It's very legalistic. So far, the quest for common ground is the quest for the minimum condition for a civilized society to exist. To apply the golden rule to every condition, and to develop a notion about reciprocity, to tolerate difference, and to put a great deal of emphasis on the procedural. And so each one of us is a rational human being. How are we going to deal with the situation if we enter into a communication? Now the Confucian position is not diametrically opposed to that. It's a radically different approach. The approach is not to focus on the thing, the lowest common denominator, but the focus is on the thick description of human flourishing. What does it mean? It means that we first reject the notion about abstract universalism. Simply, we are all rational human beings and so forth. First, to recognize our concrete condition of human existence. We call it lived concreteness. Now, any person who is a living, dynamic, transformative person is socially contextualized, is situated with a very rich history. And because each human being is unique, and a group of human beings, this particular group is different from that particular group, and so forth. So you look at the world in terms of very discrete differences. Each one is embodied in the kind of lived concreteness. To recognize that as the point of departure, the people who follow the primacy of the procedure will consider this is totally self-defeating. If you allow every person to be fully embodied as a person, communication is very different because you just see differences. However, with all the differences, there are many, many stories that can be shared. How do you communicate with a friend or with your roommate? You don't communicate with a friend by, say, getting rid of all the particularities and develop a procedure of how we can communicate to each other. You know, who's going to sit at what side of the table. If you begin that procedure with your friend, and after the first semester, I think the possibility of communication would not be established at all. You listen, you communicate, you encounter. In a very strange situation, you try to listen to each other's stories and allow the person to be situated, to be contextualized, to be historicized. Because the radical otherness, in this sense, the radical otherness is a liberating experience. It's not necessarily a confining experience. Of course, this depends upon a set of values that need to be developed. Genuine communication only happens when two fully embodied persons encounter each other willing to share stories, ideas. I've been communicating with Hans Kuhn for many, many years. And I follow his trajectory very carefully. And it's very difficult for me to look at Hans Kuhn and discuss issues with him, forgetting that he's a Christian theologian, and say, well, we're just fellow human beings, we can follow a certain kind of procedure. So I wanted to know about his own story, how he struggled with the Vatican, how he discussed those kind of issues, why he's worried about this issue, that issue, as a fully embodied Christian theologian. And he treated me as someone else. Not sharing that experience, but with other experience, but the other experience could be communicative. That's the only reason that our friendship maintained. Our friendship is not maintained because we accepted the minimalist approach. The minimalist approach, inherent in that, is a certain kind of legalistic concern, because there is the psychology of fear. We're very afraid that the other side would do something wrong to us. And in order to protect ourselves, we have to develop all these kind of rules and regulations before we can enter into the communication. But communication cannot be established if these rules and regulations are simply considered absolutely critical. So what we have in terms of the Confucian approach is to develop 6 values in reference to the 6 values in the modern West. First, to try to balance freedom with a sense of fairness. Use fairness to balance freedom, and to argue for justice in terms of a kind of communicative rationality. Equal time. I give you 5, 10, 20 minutes, listen to your story. You also give me the same amount of time, listen to my story. And gradually we'll be able to know each other. And through that knowing, which is embodied knowing, it's not just abstract knowing, we'll be able to communicate. But it's a fair play. If there's a manipulative psychology, that my freedom is more important than yours, or I have the freedom to express myself, but I don't give you any chance for you to express yourself, then there's no possibility. And involving that process is also the notion of civility, but civility enhanced by a sense of decency. Now, Buchanan, who's a neoclassics economist, recently developed this notion that for the new leader in the new economy, freedom to express, freedom to maximize one's profit, freedom to develop new ideas is not good enough. You have to develop a sense of responsibility. But a sense of responsibility is not enough. You have to develop a sense of decency. Why? Because responsibility as legally constrained. We can be responsible in the legal sense. We do not violate any rules and regulations. And still, if we're not decent, we know so much, we have so much power, we have so much economic might, we can still run the world according to a very, very inequitable situation. Africa would never have a chance if simply the idea of responsibility is developed. So the notion of decency, decency not in the sense of romantic or sentimental notion about the other. Decency is a sense that no society survives without civility. And the civility sometimes is too harsh You know, it's not as harsh as the legal constraint, but it's still too harsh. The leaders will have to be decent. Well, maybe comparable to the notion about the compassionate politics. But compassionate politics has to be predicated on a certain intelligence of understanding how the world actually works. Otherwise, the compassion can be totally misdirected. And it is in this sense, duty consciousness enriches human rights. In other words, by emphasizing the importance of rights, especially for those who are in power, who are in control, that a sense of duty becomes even more enhanced. And trust, in this sense, sustains law. Law without trust can never function itself. So trust would have to be an ingredient in the operation of the law. And of course, then you have to elevate intelligence, especially instrumental intelligence, into a sense of wisdom. I may end with this simple notion that in the modern economy with tremendous emphasis on science and technology, on virtual reality, three things that originally absolutely critical for the transmission of values from one generation to the other are relegated to the background. One is the face-to-face communication. So this idea of personalist view is that face-to-face communication cannot be replaced by anything else. You may be very, very skilled in using the computer to communicate, but still the face-to-face communication, because the nonverbal side of the communication turns out to be probably the most critical. The second one, of course, is the art of listening. And that is extremely difficult to maintain. Freedom, rights, legal constraint, intelligence, rationality, all depend upon our ability to articulate a position, to persuade others. And in so doing, we cultivated our ability to persuade. We lose sight of the need to listen. And the art of listening, in this sense, is related to a sense of fairness, decency, a sense of receptivity and sympathy. And of course, the wisdom is we call it the wisdom of the elders. Wisdom is something which is different from intelligence, from rationality, because it has to be embodied. There's no way that a person can become wise without an experiential understanding how it works, even in the case of science. If you master all the rules of the game of physics, you may not be very wise as a physician, because you only know the rules of the game, know the information, know how you haven't acquired an experiential taste of how that works. And that taste cannot be embodied simply by using your head. You have to think not only with your head, but also with your mind, with your heart, and probably with your body. So I think one very interesting lesson in the Confucian tradition is that how will you be able to learn with your body, which involves not only the head, but heart and mind and the soul and spirit. But how you learn simply not to acquire certain kind of skills, but to learn that learning as a cognitive process actually transforms yourself as a person. So that kind of ethical intelligence requires the art of listening and also requires the continuous face-to-face communication. Thank you.